Hi. So, in this third and final part of the series about my journey with MS, I want to speak to the specifically psychological factors of coping with a chronic illness. And I want to point out that when I talk about coping with a chronic illness, this, I believe, equally applies to people with mental illnesses, physical illnesses. In fact, in my work as a practicing psychologist, I've come to see the vast similarities across issues that have to do with grief and loss and change, um, that all, which has made me come to believe that most issues that really unseat us, that really unsettle us, have to do with identity and how to integrate reality as it is and not as we want it to be, um, into an identity that is positive and productive and resilient. Um, when people are dealing with illness of any type, mental or physical, I think the first and most undeniable aspect to come up is grief, that there's a tremendous amount of grieving in terms of what you have lost, what you can no longer do, the things you can no longer enjoy. Um, for instance, for me, hiking, yoga, um, walking with ease, um, not having to think through how I'm going to do something or get somewhere, not being able to just run out to the store to pick something up, but really have to plan for energy management, as well as just the logistical aspects. Um, so there's all the grief of sort of the present losses, that is, the things that you cannot do, and the pieces of your identity involved with those present losses. So I considered myself a serious hiker. I considered myself, part of my identity was as a person who had always done and reached really high levels of yoga. Um, I was a very competitive soccer player when I was younger, and I can't even kick the ball around the yard with my kids. So that's all identity and grief management in the present moment. And I think when working with people with chronic illnesses, and in being a person with a chronic illness, there's always that aspect of grief and identity management that has to be part of the conversation. That is always part of the reality. The other piece of that is that there's sort of future self grief, um, in being able to let go of what you expected your life to be, who you expected yourself to be in the future, and come to terms with who you are and what your life is now. So, I had two big dreams for my life. Um, One was to have children and be a very engaged and involved mother. The other was to be a psychologist, to to teach or do psychological research, and to see clients. One of those dreams have been very resilient to the MS. I can teach. I have a practice that I love. I'm very, very lucky that the work that I chose to do accommodates my disabilities incredibly well. And in fact, I would say to some extent, my disabilities have an added value, in that work, both in being able to do this sort of thing for students, to be able to give you a view from the inside about something that's really important in the field of health psychology and in the field of human beings generally. Um, and also with my clients to understand, you know, how much of grief and change is about identity and how to manage those losses and maintain or create an identity that you didn't expect to have to create, which is equally fulfilling as the one that you had anticipated. The life goal that has been more impacted by my MS is with my children. And I say that with mixed feelings because I was able to have the children that I so desperately wanted and the family that I so desperately wanted. It doesn't look like I thought it would. I thought I would be out there coaching their soccer games. I thought I would be taking them rock climbing. I thought I would be taking them hiking. I thought um, many things that are just not physically possible with multiple sclerosis. And those are losses that I have grieved and that I continue to grieve when a new development comes up. Like my kids right now are really interested in skateboarding. And I used to skate a little and I hung out with skaters a lot. And I love skateboarding. I would like to be out there helping them with their ollies, etc. But I can't. And so, you know, it's grief is not a one-time process. Um, Grieving, particularly in terms of an illness, goes on because there are new elements and new losses. Um, Even when those losses were theoretical, like who knew my kids would be really into skating and I would feel really sad about not being able to help them on a logistical level with skating. Um, so there's the identity management piece of that, which is okay, so I'm not that mom that I imagined that I would be. So, what kind of mom am I, and what kind of mom do I want to be, given the limitations on the physical activities? Um, and I think that that's always a work in process, and identity is a work in process for all of us all the time. Um, we all have different challenges, and we all have to figure out what that means about who we are now and creating an identity that we can live with and be comfortable with and even celebrate, um, given the suffering and the challenges of all types that we'll all face. I will say that when I was first diagnosed, I was in therapy for many years um, with just heartbreaking concern about what it would mean for my children to grow up with a mother with MS who needed to nap a lot, who had a lot of fatigue, who couldn't physically do a lot with them. And my therapist at the time, and it has really come to pass, said, children don't need you to play with them on their level all the time. They need you to be steady and constant and loving. Um, and in fact, the children who grow up facing some sort of adversity are the children who develop the most resilience and the most compassion. And I have seen that now that my children are 9 and 13, that my children are more compassionate, more sensitive to people hurting in their environment. Not me, yes, me, but beyond me. They're sensitive to holding doors for people. They're sensitive to helping people who are in an uncomfortable situation. Um, because I have to accept help from strangers and they see that, they have become strangers who help other people. And that makes me really proud. And it also calms me about my fears about the negative impacts of the MS because I can see the positive impacts and the ways that they're growing into two amazing little people because of the struggles that we face as a family. Um, Another thing I wanted to say about coping is that I used to be a very anxious, sort of perfectionist person who worried about everything on my very long to-do list. Um, with MS, I am forced to rest, and it puts everything in its proper perspective. The questions that I now grapple with is, what do I have to do today for myself, for my family, for my work? And I don't have the luxury anymore of the 100 other items that were on the list that really were never that important in the first place, but used to take up a lot of my mental space. Um, Once I was on a panel where patients who are also psychologists were doing a training for doctors at a veterans hospital. And I had the good luck to be to be placed with another speaker with MS who had previously been the clinical director in the ASU clinical psych program when I was doing my postdoc there. So I didn't know him personally, but I respected him tremendously. And in doing my talk and then listening to his, and then being able to talk together with him and with the doctors after, we were able to discuss the ways that coping and grieving and moving forward is really different based on his diagnosis, which from the beginning was primary progressive. So we knew it was it was a one-way street. And my diagnosis, which was relapsing remitting, which allowed me always to have hope that every time I lost something, it could come back or it wasn't a permanent loss, etc. One of the things that we learned in discussing it with each other and with these doctors from the VA is that there's a subset of veterans who come back from war um, where they have had the same experiences that created PTSD in their colleagues. And remember, PTSD is characterized by hypervigilance. It's a overactive threat response. And the amygdala is the part of the brain that's always scanning for threat. So when somebody has PTSD, their amygdala is working overtime. It's scanning for threat constantly, and it's finding threat where there is none. As a result of coping with near constant changes in my physical abilities, which is in fact sort of one of the surveillance roles of the amygdala. What's happening, what kind of danger am I in because of it? What's going to happen in the future? Um, I, like a certain subset of veterans, seem to have become somewhat less sensitive to my amygdala threat scan at all. So I don't worry the way that I used to. I don't worry 10% of the amount that I used to. I focus on the biggest threats, and if it's not a huge threat, I am nonplussed by it. I can't tell you what a 180-degree change that is from who I was before, but it's like my mind, my brain, my psyche gave me a break from having to constantly monitor a threat, since my threat level was always high in terms of unpredictable relapses and unpredictable losses and what that would mean at the moment and what that would mean in the future, to taking pretty much everything in stride now. And I am terribly grateful for that little adaptation that my brain has made. Other types of psychological coping mechanisms that we see all the time, and as they relate to me, is social comparison theory. So people typically compare themselves to other people, as you know. It's abundantly clear on social media. We can do upward social comparisons or downward social comparisons. meaning we can compare ourselves to people we feel are doing better than us on whatever metric we're concerned about. They look better than us, they're happier than us, they have more than us. Or we can do downward social comparisons and say, like, well, at least I don't have that, or I'm better off than this person. When we do downward social comparisons, we tend to feel better about ourselves. It tends to be protective of our self-esteem and our identity. And one of the things that I'm aware of is that I rarely do upward social comparisons about my health anymore. I rarely look at somebody without a disability or an autoimmune disease and think, oh, I wish I had that. I'm much more sensitive to hearing about people with, for instance, ALS and thinking, thank God I have MS and not ALS. Or hearing about people with sick children and thinking, thank God I'm sick instead of my children, because I don't know that I would be able to bear that. So it's a self protective mechanism to do downward social comparisons. And I find that that is in what I would consider the toolbox of sort of my natural coping mechanisms, is that I tend to feel grateful for what I have when I look at the suffering around me that is far worse than my own. Um, that also involves hope. It involves focusing on what's good, that I do have the family that I've always wanted, the work that I've always wanted. Um, I found myself saying the other day after that primary progressive diagnosis, so my life didn't turn out exactly as I thought, but it turned out pretty close. It's just that I have to do everything sitting down with more naps. And that's not so bad in terms of how life turns out. So I think the importance of hope and optimism can't be overstated, but certainly in the beginning of a journey with chronic illness or any kind of loss, um, you have to find hope and hang on to it really tight. Um, and in the end, it sort of floats up to the top. Um, One final thing, I always press students on the stress management techniques, the breathing, meditation. Um, I have found those to be invaluable to really learn how to stay in the present moment and to calm myself in this moment and not let my brain wander off to all of future events or past events, but to do those breathing exercises, to take a meditation practice very seriously. Um, we know from all of the imaging studies that people with a serious meditation practice have greater activation of the positive emotional areas of the brain, um, that their immune systems function differently, that their stress response systems function differently. We know without a doubt at this point in time that meditation and having a meditative, mindfulness based practice has so many benefits in terms of emotional and physical health, that it's undeniable. And those have been extremely important to me in my coping. Social support is really important. Having a loving family or group of friends, of people who really understand what you're going through and offer assistance. I've been very lucky with that, and it is important for everybody who's struggling to know how essential social support is in coping, so that they continue to reach out even when it's really difficult or feels impossible to do so, because we know that social support is also one of the most effective methods of coping with any of life's tragedies. Um, so I think I've covered most of what I want to cover in terms of coping, dealing with grief, the ongoing issue of identity management, social comparison, um, the importance of hope, optimism, techniques like mindfulness and meditation, the importance of social support. Um, so I'll leave you with that now, and I hope that over the course of these, you've gotten a better sense of what it's like to live with MS and also the psychology of coping, whether it's with a chronic illness or any of the myriad ways that human beings suffer.